journey of an aesthete, a comprehensive examination of all things aesthetic, the arts, the humanities, and what it means to be human. I came to the conclusion that there is a plurality of ideals, as there is a plurality of cultures and of temperaments. I am not a relativist. I do not say, oh, I like my coffee with milk, and you like it without. I'm in favor of kindness, and you prefer concentration camps. Each of us with his own values, which cannot be overcome or integrated. This I believe to be false. But I do believe that there is a plurality of values, which men can and do seek, and that these values differ. There is not an infinity of them. The number of human values that I can pursue while maintaining my human semblance, my human character, is finite. Let us say, 74 or 122 or 26, but finite, whatever it may be. And the difference it makes is that if a man pursues one of these values, I who do not am nevertheless able to understand why he pursues it and what it would be like in his circumstances for me to be induced to pursue it. Hence the possibility of human understanding. I also think these values are objective. That is to say, their nature, the pursuit of them, is part of what it means to be a human being. And this is an objective given. The fact that men are men and women are women and not dogs or cats or tables or chairs is an objective fact. And part of this objective fact is that there are certain values, and only those values, which men, while remaining men, can pursue. If I am a man or a woman with sufficient imagination, and this I do need, I can enter into a value system which is not my own, but which is nevertheless something I can conceive of men pursuing while remaining human, while remaining creatures with whom I can communicate, with whom I have some common values. For all human beings must have some common values, or they cease to be human, and also some different values, else they cease to differ, as in fact they do. That is why pluralism is not relativism, that multiple values are objective, part of the essence of humanity, rather than arbitrary creations of men's subjective fancies. Nevertheless, of course, if I pursue one set of values, I may detest another, and may think it is damaging to the only form of life that I'm able to live or tolerate for myself and others, in which case I may attack it. I may even, in extreme cases, have to go to war against it. But I still recognize it as a human pursuit. I find Nazi values detestable, but I can understand how, given enough misinformation, enough false belief about reality, one could come to believe that they're the only salvation. Of course they have to be fought, by war if need be, but I do not regard the Nazis, as some people do, as literally pathological or insane, only as wickedly, wickedly wrong, totally misguided about the facts. For example, in believing that some beings are subhuman, or that one race is central, or that Nordic races alone are truly creative, and so forth. I see how, with enough false education, enough widespread illusion and error, men can, while remaining men, believe this and commit the most unspeakable crimes. If pluralism is a valid view, and respect between systems of values which are not necessarily hostile to each other is possible, then toleration and liberal consequences follow, as they do not either from monism, only one set of values is true, all the others are false, or from relativism, my values are mine, yours are yours, and if we clash too bad, neither of us can claim to be right. My political pluralism is a product of reading Vico and Herder, and of understanding the roots of Romanticism, which in its violent pathological form went too far for human toleration. So with nationalism, the sense of belonging to a nation seems to me quite natural, and not in itself to be condemned or even criticized, but in its inflamed condition, my nation is better than yours. I know how the world should be shaped, and you must yield because you do not, because you're inferior to me, because my nation is top, and yours is far, far below mine, and must offer itself as material to mine, which is the only nation entitled to create the best possible world. It is a form of pathological extremism which can lead and has led to unimaginable horrors, and is totally incompatible with the kind of pluralism that I have attempted here to describe. It may be an interest to remark, incidentally, that there are certain values that we in our world accept, which were possibly created by early Romanticism that did not even exist before. For example, the idea that variety is a good thing, that a society in which many opinions are held and those holding different opinions are tolerant of each other is better than a monolithic in which one opinion is binding on everyone. Nobody before the 18th century could have accepted that. Truth was one, and the idea of variety was inimical to it. Again, the idea of sincerity as a value is something new. It was always right to be a martyr to the truth, but only to the truth. Muslims who died for Islam were poor, foolish, misled creatures who died for nonsense. So for Catholics were Protestants, and Jews and pagans. And the fact that they held their beliefs sincerely made them know better. What was important was to be right. In discovering the truth, as in every other walk of life, success was what was important, not motive. If a man says to you that he believes that twice 2 is 17, and someone says, he doesn't do it to annoy you, he doesn't do it because he wants to show off or because he has been paid to say it, he really believes that twice 2 is 17, he really believes it, he's a sincere believer, you would say, that makes it no better, he is talking irrational nonsense. This is what Protestants were doing in the views of many Catholics and vice versa. The more sincere, in fact, the more dangerous. No marks were given for sincerity until this new notion that there is more than one answer to a question, that is, pluralism, became more widespread. This is what led values to be set on motive rather than consequence, on sincerity rather than on success. The enemy of pluralism is monism, a very ancient belief that there is a single harmony of truths into which everything, if it is genuine, in the end must fit. The consequence of this belief, which is something different from or akin to what Karl Popper calls essentialism, to him the root of all evil, is that those who know should command those who do not. Those who know the answers to some of the great problems of mankind must be obeyed, for they alone know how society should be organized, how individual lives should be lived, how culture should be developed. This is an old Platonic belief in the philosopher king, entitled to give orders to others. There have always been thinkers who hold that only sentiments or scientifically trained persons should be put in charge of things, and the world will be vastly improved. To this, I have to say that no better excuse or even reason has ever been propounded for unlimited despotism on the part of an elite, which robs the majority of its essential liberties. Someone once remarked that in the old days, men and women were brought as sacrifices to a variety of gods. For these, the modern age has substituted new ideals, isms. To cause pain, to kill, to torture are in general rightly condemned, but if these things are done not for my personal benefit, but for an ism, socialism, nationalism, fascism, communism, fanatically held religious belief, or progress, or the fulfillment of the laws of history, then they are in order. Most revolutionaries believe covertly or overtly that in order to create the ideal world, eggs must be broken. Otherwise, one cannot obtain an omelet. Eggs are certainly broken, never more violently than in our own time, but the omelet is far to seek. It recedes into an infinite distance. This is one of the corollaries of unbridled monism, as I call it. Some call it fanaticism, but monism is at the root of every extremism. Now, those words I just read were not from me. They were from a man named Isaiah Berlin. And Isaiah Berlin wrote that towards the end of his life, actually in the last year of his life, in 1997. And he was someone who was born in Riga in, I believe the year is 1909. And he was a Russian thinker. And he was somebody who had a very rich life, a very long life. And eventually, as a Jew, became an Oxford Don, which was quite something at the time that he did it. And those were his words, not mine. I read them to you, not because necessarily we're going to talk much about Berlin, but because he was a major influence on me. When I discovered his work in the middle 90s, it basically revolutionized my thinking to a great extent. So those were his words. This brings us to the subject of my podcast, which of course is aesthetics, as it's titled Journey of an Aesthete. If you look up online or in dictionaries or books for the word aesthete, you will find very few entries. In fact, you'll find zip. If you look up aesthetics, you'll find thousands of entries. So aesthete as a noun, as a title or an identity, is something that people seem to not claim for themselves. And this is curious because we live in a time now in which there are many identities. Those identities are championed. Sometimes they're attacked or defended. So it's interesting that this is an identity that is not really to be seen. But if you look at the origin of it, you of course realize that to be an aesthete is to be someone who is not just a lover of beauty. It's much broader than that. It's actually deeper than that. It's somebody who's interested in aesthetics. But if you think hard about aesthetics, aesthetics are a connection to what humans make, what humans create when they're not just simply surviving or functioning. And that encompasses a great deal. In fact, it's so vast, I can't even, when you think about it, it's a lot of stuff. So I have a list here of things I wrote down. Let me get this here. It's quite a list. If I think about their cultural objects that humans create, and there's a lot of ways people talk about it. Sometimes people will talk about, they'll talk about art, of course, or they will talk about media. Increasingly now when these things are talked about, they're often talked about as media, sometimes mass media. That's mainly a question of the medium, the fact that something's photographed or something's danced or it's done in person or it's an image or it's a sculpture. Or my favorite word actually is representation. And the reason why I like that word is because almost all of what I'm discussing is representational. You're representing something rather than encountering it directly. That gets at the heart of the human need to transform matter. Humans create things, and those things are representational. They're also connected to, I guess, reflection. That's the only word I can seem to come up with. If you notice in your life, I don't think that you can reflect and act at the same time. Reflection is something you do away from action, per se. Reflection is when you it's actually connected to spiritual practice too. And that's very important. Now, I don't want to give the impression that we're talking about a particular denomination or even a particular religion, although the aesthetic life and aesthetics are inseparable from religious traditions and spirituality, because when you reflect, you come face to face with yourself and you have time to think about, what is the meaning of life, how one ought to live, what's a right or a wrong action, these kinds of questions. And you notice in works of art, particularly dramatic works of art, you see representations of humans doing things in social life. And that's where we get a lot of our genres, like romance, drama, tragedy, certainly comes from that. You're taking situations from reality, and you're kind of presenting them to the world in such a way that humans can see that and they can say, well, I think I may have experienced something like that, or that's kind of interesting, or that was like, last Tuesday when Uncle Bob did that, or that was like my first marriage, or my first divorce, or that's how I felt when I was 15, and so on. The reason why people think of these things is because that's actually partly the point of works of art. Authors of works of art are actually very conscious of these issues, and they're actually conscious of trying to figure out. Well, they're not trying to find the true answer. They're trying to, I think, ask the best questions, and actually, the best questions, I think, will cause movement, and that's the whole point of reflection. So, if you think about when I think about the things about which I am most enthusiastic, and I look at this list, it's just, it's things like Henry James' Portrait of a Lady. I've got movies here. I have Smokey and the Bandit. I have Rosie and Michelle's High School Reunion. I have The Harvey Girls. I have Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs, not the remake. I have Jane Austen novels. I have Bill Evans and Art Tatum piano solos. I have Duke Ellington's orchestral suites. I have the movie Top Hat. I have Busby Berkeley's Dames. I have Tarkovsky movies. I have Ozu movies, Ingmar Bergman movies, Aaron Copland's Piano Sonata. I have Richard Pryor monologues, and many more. Now, I have all these lists, these titles, because in spite of, or because they're apparent violation of commonality in most respects, they all do just that. What they do is they argue on their own behalf. They say, look at this. Or they say, look at me, actually. They say, well, this is my attempt to bring you into my own system. And they're essentially arguments on their behalf. They say, we're going to look at this, and they're actually, this is kind of this is an old phrase, they're true to themselves. Now that formulation is overused, but it's simply necessary. The things I mentioned all have a point of view. They're not written by a generic bot or a committee. They certainly can be collaborative. They can be created by several people working together. It's not always a single person. But they have a point of view, and they express that point of view with something like purity. And that point of view is revealed to an audience, and the audience basically has to enter into that point of view. There's no escaping it. They kind of kidnap the viewer in a way. And you might not like it, you might like it, but the thing of it is that there's no compromise about them. So, such that I think that if you undergo them, or if you enter into the reflection, or the fruits of that reflection, hopefully you might become something of a different person than when you went in at the end of it. That's kind of an ideal or goal. Harold Bloom, the literary critic, has a phrase called self-overhearing, which is what he thinks Shakespeare is doing. It's a person, basically overhearing themselves. And of course, that's what people do when they meditate and when they do contemplation. This is why I said earlier it is in part spiritual. Everybody needs an anchor in life. You, me, just everybody. Anchor made this whole show possible. I'm immensely grateful to them. You too can use Anchor to make your own shows and create your own vision.
Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you.
So I mentioned reflection, and I mentioned what my approach was going to be. So my approach on actually every podcast I'm going to do, whether there's a guest or not a guest or how many guests there are, is philosophical. Now, I want to make a couple things, clear some things up about that choice, that formulation. I have here philosophy, unlike most other subjects, does not try to extend our knowledge by discovering new information about the world. So it doesn't want to do that. It tries to deepen our understanding by reflection on what is already closest to us in our experiences, our thoughts, our concepts and activities that make up our lives, and that ordinarily escape notice because they are so familiar. Philosophy begins by finding utterly mysterious the things that pervade our everyday lives, such as language, perception, value, truth. For everyday purposes, we don't have to know how these things are possible. We talk, we see what is in front of us, we judge that this action is wrong or that assertion is true. But it is possible in this tradition deriving from Plato and others to stop and think about what we are really doing, not for a practical purpose, but just in order to understand what lies beneath the familiar surface of life. More ironically, if this is the case for philosophy, Plato and the Platonic traditions quarrel with poetry, and the arts was utterly mistaken, because this is also the aim of the poet. The poet might be said to be engaging in the same project, if by slightly different means. So the other thing I want to mention about this is what I would call perception. Now, when I think about my earliest memories, they're so intense and they're so vivid that they're almost as if they occurred to me this morning or right now. Mm-hmm. And my earliest memories are of works of art. They're simply things that some human made somewhere that was teaching me something. I think in many cases different things every time. So as a toddler, I was crawling around on the floor and stuff, and I used to get out certain record albums that were in the house, and it was music I loved. And I have no idea why I actually was led to this album and not that album. That's very mysterious. But there were certain albums I kept coming back to and over again. And what I remember were the Bach-Brandenburg concertos, a Bessie Smith singing the blues. Let me think. Neil Diamond, Jonathan Livingston Seagull. These are the albums I was drawn to. Charles Ives symphonies. A little Miles Davis record from France. I think it was his soundtrack to the Louis Malle film, Elevated to the Gallows with Jean Moreau. I thought that's the first Miles Davis I heard. And then the second Miles Davis I heard after that was his funky stuff. So I completely skipped all the famous stuff I got to later for some reason. That's the nature of living. I was at that time of living. Well, I had two homes. My first home was in New York City, but then I moved to Tampa, Florida, and so you kind of, you have to deal with whatever record stores have and all that. So I heard this Miles Davis soundtrack to this 50s French film that just blew me away. That the sound of his horn and the beauty of it. I couldn't even begin to talk about it in a very. I need some time, not now, to try to formulate how you would even articulate or describe that. And then I saw certain things at the movie theaters, and I saw the first films I saw. I think were 2001: Space Odyssey, Kubrick. An England film by the Italian filmmaker Michelangelo Antonioni called Blow Up with David Hemmings, which I was obsessed with Blow Up for most of my childhood.
that film, this man photographing what he thought to be a murder, and his obsession with trying to find who the killer was. I was seriously obsessed with this movie. I don't know why. There was something about the beauty of London, or this London park that he was in, and maybe the beauty of Vanessa Redgrave and Verushka, these models in the film. But I think above all, the thing that I liked about the movie is that there was no solution to the mystery. I just found that just so much more interesting than a traditional murder mystery where there was a solution. And that was a big influence on me. I also saw live performances of music. I saw different kinds of music, classical, New York City Ballet. I was able to see New York City Ballet with Suzanne Farrell and Peter Martin. And then just everything that came through New York, because in the summers it was really cheap to go to New York because everybody's afraid of it in the 70s. So I saw everything that came through there. If you can think of it, I saw it. So I saw everything Lanford Wilson did, Sam Shepard, all the Shakespeare in the Park, the Joseph Papp stuff, all the musicals at the time. There's that Bob Fosse show now on FX. And I fell in love with the show Chicago because I saw Chita Rivera and Gwen Verdon do that, and that was a big influence on me on all sorts of levels. I mean, it was influence on my psychology. Musically, I loved Kander and Ebb's score. I loved the feeling of the 20s that it evoked, and I loved the sexiness of it. It just was really, really inspirational. But I also liked musicals that had a kind of a sweeter tone. I fell in love with Guys and Dolls by Frank Lesser, and I actually, because the technology was so primitive in 1978, when the movie version was on the TV, I would take a tape recorder, a secret tape recorder, and put it up to the TV just so I can record the songs of Gene Simmons singing "If I Were a Bell" and Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando, because I had a crush on Gene Simmons too at that time for some reason. So these were all these influences, and I didn't really know what to really do with all this, really. But I think they were good influences. So I think it's really important that whatever you do in life, that you have the best influences, not the worst. So everything that I'm mentioning was good, like it was well made. And I sort of think that that's important. I kind of worry a little bit for people that, when we're discussing the subject of art as a word, I don't use it as an honorific. I use it descriptively. So it encompasses a lot of things. It could be a TV commercial. It could be what they used to call a girly magazine. And it could be the Sistine Chapel. It could be David. It's from the highest to the lowest. It's vast. It's vast. And so I have no... I don't think it's all equally good at all. I think some things are better than other things, but I have absolutely no patience for the kind of elitism that tries to label and evaluate art according to this elitist, because it's actually wrong. Because I've seen some of the greatest things ever made on network television. I just have. And I've seen some avant-garde experimental films, of which I've seen many because I'm a fan of that. Some of which are missed the mark, or were not entirely successful, or interesting. I like both. I mean, I like it all. But I've seen and of course I've seen a lot of commercial junk. But I think it's really important as a human being to. I think you have to find where your heart is, what your passion is, and I think you kind of have to narrow things a little bit. Like as a musician, I only have certain influences. I'm not influenced by everything. There are a lot of things I never got engrossed in because they weren't my métier, right? And so as a pianist, I was soaking up a lot of piano influences as a child. I was very interested in Ramsey Lewis and Ray Charles. Now, the way that Ramsey Lewis and Ray Charles played the piano is very different. It's much more rooted in church music and blues music than other pianists, and so of course that had an influence on me. And that was just a function of just discovering. I came across a church, an African-American church, and this kid played organ, and I just loved the style of the music and the language. It was I liked that. But I also liked other things. I liked Broadway shows. I liked Bill Evans, of course, a big influence. A lot of people. But I think that on the one hand, people make the mistake of not evaluating things as well as they should, and they think everything is great when it isn't. And I think on the other hand, they make very arbitrary. I see this all, especially today. Like I see people have an attitude of disparagement about things that people make, and that makes me really angry. I saw an interview with an exploitation filmmaker. I think it's Frank Henenlotter. I don't know how you pronounce that guy's last name, but he made just grade B, kind of sex and violence type of pictures. He made Frankenhooker. Actually, I saw Frankenhooker at the New Art Cinema in Los Angeles in 1992, and I enjoyed it. But Henenlotter was asked questions about, well, what's a good movie or a bad movie? Do you like, John Waters? Do you like this kind of stuff? And he said, you know what? Or do you like Doris Wishman? Oh, as a side note, I saw Doris Wishman's Let Me Die a Woman as a child in 42nd Street, which is, some people today would say is not something a child should see, but I saw it. So my movie watching was actually very similar to Quentin Tarantino's, because I saw all the Grindhouse, or also the R-rated movies as a child that kids aren't supposed to see. Yeah. And I actually think it was good I saw that stuff, because what it does is it teaches you about, well, one of the things it does, it might traumatize you, but it also might teach you about the dark side of life, or evil, because that's a subject in art that's very important. It's not a good idea to go through life and not have an understanding of evil, or at least an awareness that it's part of life, which those kind of movies do or did. But I think Henenlotter was asked this interesting question. It's like, well, what movies do you hate, or what do you like? And he said, you know how hard it is to make a movie? Do you know? He says, I will never, ever talk bad about anybody's film. There's not a director you can mention. I don't care, John Ford, Howard Hawks, whoever. I won't do it because it's just blood, sweat, and tears. It's too hard. Ask somebody else. If you want somebody else to badmouth somebody's film, not me. And I actually thought that was one of the most interesting things I've ever read in an interview. I don't know if I don't entirely agree, because there's movies I don't like, of course. But I think there's something to it. And that gets the other thing. So my approach is going to be philosophical. It's also going to be creator-based. My emphasis in every podcast I'm going to do is from the point of view of the author, the creator. And the reason for that is I think that's the heart of it. I think people make things. And I think you understand better the thing that's made from the point of view of how the thing is put together than from the critic's point of view. I am a critic, so I'm not against criticism. But I think that, and criticism can be an art form, as Henry James said. But that's only when criticism is an art form. But today, critics, for the most part, they don't meet the thing halfway. They try to find some way to disparage it, or to try to be second guess it, or be cynical about it. This attitude of cynicism I see a lot, and that's actually not very useful, because any work of art it comes out of great struggle and great toil, and it's made, and there's pre-production and production and post-production, whatever it is, and you at least should try to meet it halfway. At the end of the day, you have to make a decision. You have to say, well, this isn't for me. Which people do. The other thing interesting about art is that in artworks, you actually get criticism of other artworks. And so in a way, you almost don't need criticism, because the artwork becomes a criticism. So for example, Barbara Loden's Wanda is a commentary on the movie Bonnie and Clyde. That was actually an inspiration for her to make the damn thing. So she's actually already commenting on a film by making another film. That's very interesting, I think. So I think it's quite possible you can like Bonnie and Clyde, Arthur Penn's great, admittedly a masterpiece, and also like Wanda. even though Wanda is quarreling. I mean, Wanda is a savage. It's kind of like I feel it's like all of Barbara Loden's feelings about, I guess, representation of women on the screen would be a way to put it, I think, but also about genre, her feelings about the thriller genre. And as a result of expressing her feelings, she made a remarkable film. Well, that's a kind of a criticism. But the reason why it's better than most criticisms I've read of action films written by critics, or at least traditional macho action films, is that she actually enacts she makes visible through actors performing a criticism of that. So she's actually using the same tools that action directors used. And a really interesting thing happened. So she's using those tools to work against the cliches that she's, and anybody can do that. You can do that in music. It's not restricted to one art form. You can see it in the novel. You see it in theater, because I've seen some very traditional theater. You know, when I was little, I saw every Neil Simon play, but I also saw No Man's Land, directed by Peter Hall with Sir John Gielgud and Sir Ralph Richardson. That play blew my mind. That's a play of two old men on a stage. The whole play is two old men on the stage quarreling with each other. And I have to tell you this. I actually had to walk out on after Act 1. I was not able to stay for the whole thing because my parents did not dig it. That made me so mad. Not only did I want to see Act 2, I actually liked No Man's Land. But that's an example of a playwright, in this case Harold Pinter, I think, reaching for something that may not be immediately, immediately enjoyable by everybody. But that's kind of a weird thing if you think about it, because if you think about Sir Ralph Richardson and Sir John Gielgud and who they are and what they're about, that's tough. That's tough. I mean, he ended up being my favorite playwright, or one of them, actually, because part of that is because of my own deficits. So sometimes a work of art, art could do one of two things. It could actually support you in your own experience. So you could see something that feels like, well, so you feel you're not alone. That's one very important function of art. Another function is the opposite of that. It's actually to visit something you don't understand or you're not familiar with, to get outside of yourself. And all good art does both, or can do one or the other. And both are important. And so for me, people like Pinter and Edward Albee were basically teaching me things about human relationships which I did not understand at all. And I sort of feel like that in watching these kind of plays, which took that as their subject matter, I was actually learning about things that were difficult or I didn't immediately understand. Now, somebody else that does understand well the things those plays we're dealing with maybe would not be as captivated by it, or maybe would take it as a matter of course or something. I mean, I think the thing I got from Harold Pinter is the thing about obliquity and opacity as opposed to transparency, indirection. It reminds me of that old quote that humans invented language not to communicate, but to try to get things without communicating. I think that's a quote I read somewhere. I don't remember where that was, but that's kind of I don't want to get too into the weeds on this stuff, and I don't want to be boring. I just was giving you an example of the things these were the things that taught me before I even went to school or actually, and of course school was a whole other thing because I went to music school and I had wonderful teachers there. And it's really a good thing to have wonderful teachers, or teachers that inspire you. There's just nothing replaces that. So I've had some awakenings in my life, and one of the awakenings was discovering Isaiah Berlin, because I had been At the time I discovered him, I was a very scientific-minded person. I kind of believed in a way, not believed is too strong a word, but I kind of accepted the age of reason. And I kind of did think the world followed these kind of ironclad laws. And Berlin kind of demolished all that, because he's somebody who lived through the Soviet. As a child, he witnessed actual murder or beatings of people in the streets after the Bolsheviks took power, and that had a lasting impression on him. I think that was in probably 1916 or so. He saw this violence committed by Red Guards in the street, and that he never forgot it. And I think that's why he dedicated his life to trying to understand why someone would do that for a cause. But I think also Berlin was really interested in the Romantics, and he had this theory that things like sincerity were new and did not exist for most of human history, which is kind of a radical, counterintuitive idea. If you ask somebody to be sincere, well, people have always had a concept or practice of sincerity. Not according to Berlin. To him, in 1650, there was no sincerity. Like, people had a very objective external view of reality. They were either doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And they didn't have this kind of deep introspective notion of there being a gap between intention and action. And Berlin is saying, hey, there's this gap. It's like somebody could be dead wrong about something, but you can have empathy for their wrongness. So say, well, I could see if I grew up in those circumstances, I could have that false view. And he felt that this new value of sincerity helped people to do that. That it was a kind of a new way of approaching reality. It may be connected with psychology. Actually, I think it might be connected with not just both psychoanalysis in the original, but also the whole panoply of psychology, which is like some of it involves mystical ideas. If you think about Carl Jung, who was Freud's friend and then later broke with Freud, but also just garden variety, cognitive behavioral therapy, and all sorts of things. I think they're all useful for people, but they're all connected to this idea of you feel something inside of yourself. I think this is what James Dean was doing. I sort of feel like that there was a revolution in the arts, and I sort of think the revolution. I sort of think the revolution might begin with Montgomery Clift in Place in the Sun. Because I think if you go back and look at Montgomery Clift in A Place in the Sun, and Elizabeth Taylor too, interestingly enough, even though you might not initially equate them as exactly the same, they're doing things with their body, and they're doing things in their acting that I don't think people had seen on the screen before. A kind of some people call it a rawness or emotional directness. I think when things like that happen, like in the arts, I think it can change the world. I think it can explode. I actually think that streaming television, I'm going to make a very bold assertion. I actually think that streaming dramatic television is the same thing now. I think it's a revolution in the arts that we haven't begun to fully theorize or understand yet, because it's happening. Because we're going to. I think it's a new way of presenting dramatic material that's not exactly like movie, not exactly like the novel, not even the serialized form. I mean, it does have connection to Dickens and the 19th century. It's not totally new, but I think it is a new thing. And I think it is quite interesting and exciting for people that are into it. I think that that's kind of what the method acting was. I think that there, or what Miles Davis was doing in his Trumpet. I think you can have these things that occur, and people go, well, I've never heard anything like that before, and they're kind of swept off their feet, or they go, what was that? And I think that's what Pinter was doing in theater. But there's also craft. I think a lot of great art is not innovative in this way, or it doesn't have to be. It could just be great craft. And I think that, people that try to write a well-made psalm, actually the ability to write a well-made song is so difficult, to write a perfect melody. I remember in music school I was in love with the Gershwin song Embraceable You, and I gave it to my music theory teacher, James Hoffman, who is now dead, rest in peace. I said, I really wanted to understand this song Embraceable You. I want to analyze it the way that you analyze Bach or Mozart, because I think it's just as good as Bach or Mozart. He said, yeah, let's do this. And he came back with this chart, and I still have it to this day. That was in 1987, and I still carry the damn thing around, because it was I wish I were at my piano now. I would start playing Embraceable You. We'll have to do that. That excites me because I think George Gershwin is creating something like a perfect song. And then what is a perfect song? So I have 2 quotes here, both filmmakers. Robert Bresson, I think, said that he wants a film to affect your emotions more than for the viewer to understand it. I think that's what he said. He said he wants a movie. He wants a person to feel his movie, more than understand his movie. And I think John Cassavetes, who's he's a whole topic onto himself, obviously. But I think he said that if he thought somebody, I think, said something to him in an interview. I said, well, I think he said, I can't imagine what kind of film director, any film director that would want to make a movie that doesn't move the emotions of the audience is an asshole. And that's of course a very direct way of putting it. I think the place of emotion and affect in art is really important. I also think it's a problem because I think that right now people have a kind of it's interesting. I think some works of art are more emotional than others. Like I think there's a kind of a classicism to. Well, I mean, if you think about a French filmmaker like Jacques Rivette, his work has feelings in it, but there's also a kind of a classical quality. We often think as the classical is cool or formal. We think of the romantics as hot and as more emotional. I mentioned Place in the Sun and all that. Again, this is back to pluralism because I think you need both. I think you need works of art that are hot and that grip, that affect the emotions directly and cause people to, even divide audiences. I mean, look at that HBO show, Girls. I mean, it's an amazing thing to me. People argued more about that show, and they formed camps around that show, and they fought. Are the characters self-indulgent? Do they have big egos? Are they spoiled? Are they forerunners? And are they, And what's amazing to me about that is that none of those commentators actually really dealt with the show, because it was a really good show, but almost like they got sidetracked by the circus or the kind of the hoopla around the show. But I'm interested, if I was going to do a show on girls, I would talk about, well, how did they write that? Who are these characters? Who is Sash and Hannah and these, and what does it mean for you to create these characters? And what do you think? Was the impetus for that scene? And is it about a kind of boyfriend that the character had? And how did you feel? Because that's actually what all art is about. So actually, if we were talking about girls that way, would be, I think, the right way to talk about that show. But that's so infrequently done. So there's a lot more I can say, but I feel I've gone on for too long. I could talk about style and how everything is style, and how style is not superficial, but is content. Because if you think about, just think about your life. Everything you encounter is a style. The clothes that people wear are a style, and there's even styles of child rearing. Where now children run around in department stores and in aisles and stuff instead of staying put like they did in the old days. And these are just changes in styles of child rearing, but everything has a style because a style is an expression of the human soul and the human spirit. And you want your style to be your own style, not somebody else's style. You don't want a handed down style. You want it to be an expression of you and not someone else, right? And so style is pretty important. And that's all I'm going to say for my first show. I have really a lot of good feelings about this show. When I have a guest on, I want to honor that guest. And I actually want that guest to express what they're trying to do, whatever the subject is. I do not want to impose my crap on that guest, if at all possible. I want that guest to express, what they've been creating and talk about it in a kind of serious way, and talk about who they are and where they've come from and how they ended up at the point of the interview. And this all comes back to me being an aesthete, which means that these are the kinds of things I'm concerned with. And I hope you will go on this journey with me. I don't like goodbyes, so I will see you soon.